I have to say at the beginning that this meeting isn't taking place in Cyprus, which I would have loved to have gone to, and hope that it will be possible that we can meet again sometime this year or next year. I also want to compliment all of you organisers for your initiative, and particularly your patience with an elderly Antipodean living in France. My paper is in fact very parallel in many ways to what we've just heard, because when the British took over the administration of Cyprus in 1878, they opened the way for explorers of all nations and kinds to an extent that hadn't happened before. Freed from Ottoman rule, the island became the happy hunting ground, literally and metaphorically, for professionals and amateurs alike, who are now able to take advantage of the new administration's liberality, or rather laissez-faire, to study all aspects of the island's ecology, history, and society. According priority to the immediate needs of health, infrastructure, and land management, and burdened by the Turkish tribute, the new British administration had little time or money for research of any kind. And this gap was filled in their program by numerous outside visitors, amongst them Dr. Francis Henry Hill Guillemard. Next slide. I'm sorry, the next slide. There we are. Best known as one of the founding fathers of the Cyprus Exploration Fund in 1887, Guillemard did not study the classics at the University of Cambridge, but the natural sciences, and having graduated in 1874, went on to train as a medical doctor at Gonville and Caius College, qualifying in 1881. He was, however, sufficiently well acquainted with the classical world to be able to read ancient Greek inscriptions. He nevertheless became involved with Cyprus not as an archaeologist, but as an ornithologist during 2 expeditions he undertook on behalf of Lord Lilford, another British ornithologist who had been to the island in 1875. Rheumatic gout had prevented Lilford from returning to Cyprus himself, and it's interesting to reflect that but for his indisposition, the Cyprus Exploration Fund might not have come into existence, and the development of Cypriot archaeology would have taken a different course. Note the dead bird on his desk and the bird on the back of his chair. Guillemard's purpose in going to Cyprus was to collect bird specimens, of which he obtained a thoroughly representative series, now in the Whitaker collection of birds in the National Museums of Scotland, Edinburgh. On his bird hunting activities in the island, Guillemard published 2 articles, one on ornithological notes of a tour in Cyprus in 1887, followed by another one on the same subject, Cyprus and its birds, in 1888. The drawing of the Cyprian coal tit on the left accompanied his first article, and on the right is an illustration of the same bird from the Bannerman's definitive volume on the birds of Cyprus. And you'll find all of Guillemard's publications about Cyprus in CAARI's digital Cobham. Having private means, Guillemard never practiced as a medical doctor in England, but spent most of his career as a naturalist who toured the world before being appointed on 12 June 1888, Cambridge University's first lecturer in geography, a post he held for only 6 months. He eventually settled in Cambridge, where he spent the rest of his life in the style and comfort, or lack of it, of Victorian days in the old mill house, Trumpington. It's noteworthy that Guillemard was not one of the original members of the committee formed to administer the newly established Cyprus Exploration Fund, nor is he recorded as having made an initial subscription. The prospectus issued by the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies in 1888 merely stated that the committee has already received promises of cooperation from Mr. D.G. Hogarth, Fellow of Magdalen College, and from Dr. F.H.H. Guillemard, the well-known traveller and zoologist who spent some months last year in Cyprus and has taken an active interest in the prosecution of archaeological work there. The genesis of Guillemard's contribution to Cypriot archaeology is to be found in 2 extended visits he made to the island from February to June 1887, and from November 1887 to June 1888. In the preliminary report of the first season's work of the Cyprus Exploration Fund in 1887-1888, Hogarth wrote that in the early months of 1887, Dr. Guillemard, a well-known traveller and ornithologist, spent a considerable time in Cyprus and in the less well-known parts of the island, and saw and heard so much of continual discoveries, legitimate and illegitimate, that on his return to England, he lost no time in pressing the desirability of sending an expedition on many who were interested in matters archaeological. Now, Guillemard's diaries, all of which but one are in CAARI's archives, indicate that the development of Guillemard's latent interest in the past was secondary to the collection of large numbers of dead birds. There were few days on his travels around the island away from the main urban centres that he did not record the shooting and skinning of birds. He nevertheless took every opportunity to inspect the ancient ruins and inscriptions he came across in his travels. And this is the only photograph of his known to have been published. It shows ruins of a site in the Karpas. Guillemard also let it be known whenever he or wherever he and his party made a stop that he was interested in acquiring what he called antiques. In this way, he bought, picked up, and was given numerous objects, mostly small items of sculpture, pots and coins, few of which are described or sourced in his diaries. Typically in the village of Perachorio near Nicosia, he was offered and acquired on the 5th of March 1887 a little stone head with well-marked Egyptian features. It was to become later of a Syrian type in excellent preservation. It could be this one in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. Guillemard also observed what he called the rifling of a tomb in Lapithos in May 1887, and he even did a little fossicking himself. On the 23rd of March 1887, he dug up in the vicinity of Curium a miniature head that was just worth keeping, and on the 7th of June 1887, in Polis, a tomb was opened for him. As it was full of earth, he and the workmen explored two of the niches, one of which contained a very nice gold ring, which Williamson very kindly gave me. In John William Williamson, expatriate businessman and entrepreneur, Guillemard found a sportsman and mouflon hunter whose knowledge of the people, animals and birds was probably more extensive than that of any other European on the island. And on the 2nd of June, 1887, Williamson presented Guillemard with the fine skull and skin of mouflon. Guillemard himself said he published from his motivation in the following terms. I had interests too, other than those of a naturalist, which tended to keep it in my mind. No one could ramble as I had for months together over the countless ruins with which every acre of it is strewn, or read the history of its past greatness and the infinite vicissitudes as it has experienced, without wishing that something could be done to bring to light the many treasures that under any other government but our own would long ago have been reposing on the shelves of our National Museum. On my return to England, I had done my best to bring about such a result. Ultimately, it was decided that the universities of Oxford and Cambridge should join under the auspices of the Hellenic Society in the work of archaeological exploration upon the island, and before the Exploration Fund had sprung into existence and was in possession of sufficient money to commence operations. Now, this testimonial tends to shed a different light on the reasons behind Guillemard's initiative. What he appears to have regretted is that systematic excavations had not taken place in Cyprus because of a lack of interest by the British government, so that antiquities could be found to fill the British Museum and other museums in England. And this objective is also reflected in the prospectus for the Cyprus Exploration Fund issued by the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies, where it is stated that private and casual excavations have lately been prohibited by authority, and that once the fund had received the British government's sanction and approval to dig in the island, the British Museum will naturally be regarded as having the right of first choice to the objects recovered. Though Hogarth's reference to legitimate and illegitimate discoveries might be taken to mean that Guillemard was concerned about the unscientific way excavations were being conducted under the former regime, and determined to transform these investigations into a more scholarly enterprise, it would seem that the pursuit of historical knowledge was initially at least of lesser importance than the acquisition of antiquities for public institutions in England. For its part, the Hellenic Society, which was not to be a recipient of any of the artifacts found, justified its involvement on the grounds that the High Commissioner of Cyprus, who has recently forbidden any private excavations on the island, expressed his willingness to give proper facilities in accordance with the laws of the land to a comprehensive scheme of excavation on a scientific basis. It so happened that in mid-June 1887, who was High Commissioner of Cyprus at the time, announced the banning of all private excavations and decided that in future permits would be granted only to foreign museums and recognized antiquarian institutions. They would still be entitled to 1/3 share of the fines in accordance with the 1874 Ottoman Antiquities Law. By also stopping privately funded and conducted digs and authorizing only those with institutional backing, Bulwer was clearly favouring collective British endeavours, of which the Cyprus Exploration Fund was the first beneficiary. Guillemard recorded in his diaries dining with Bulwer, after whom a wattled pheasant from Southeast Asia was named, as you see on the right of the slide, and he called on Government House in June 1887 before his departure to see the High Commissioner and discuss mouflon and digging antiquities. Guillemard showed scant interest in the local inhabitants of Cyprus, who for him were largely suppliers of manpower services and antiquities, but he became acquainted with several of the British officials with a well-defined taste for the past. One of them was Claude Delaval Cobham, the erudite district commissioner in Larnaca, whom he described on the 22nd of February 1887 in his diaries as fairly affable, but Oxford and a bit stiff. Only a graduate of Cambridge University could have used Oxford as a slight to describe Cobham. Amongst the others recorded by name in his diary, Samuel Brown, government engineer and collector of antiquities, appears not to have been part of Guillemard's charmed circle of acquaintances. After an encounter with him in Kyrenia, Guillemard described him as rather a good sort, but H-less, meaning that he dropped his H's when speaking. For a person of Guillemard's class, Brown was held to be of lesser education and lower social status. Also conspicuous by the absence from his list of personalities is Max Ornithologist Richter, who was particularly put out by the arrival of the British archaeologists. His nomination by the Cyprus Museum Committee to be its official representative at the fund's fieldwork was rejected by the island's administration, which named Hogarth as inspector for the British government. Ornithologist Richter later took his revenge in a long, pointed and self-serving review of Hogarth's archaeological travelogue Divia Cypria in the Berliner Philologische Wochenschrift in 1891. The first season's work by the fund concentrated on the Bronze Age site of Leandari Vuno, the Temple of Aphrodite at Pelepophos, and the late first millennium BC sanctuary site at Armageti in the Paphos region. It yielded a substantial harvest of antiquities, including many inscriptions. Guillemard himself visited Kuklia on the 25th of April, 1888, while the excavation was still in progress under Hogarth's supervision, and noted that the temple digging has been most successful. When it came to the end of the season, Hogarth was able to report that the division of spoil, according to Ottoman law, was arranged on very favourable terms for us. 1/3 of the finds were to remain in the island for the Cyprus Museum, and the remainder, contained in 19 cases, were shipped to England. They arrived at the end of September 1888 to be divided between the British, Ashmolean and Fitzwilliam Museums. Guillemard occupies a singular place in the study of Cyprus's past. His only academic contribution to the knowledge of the island's cultural heritage was the identification of perfected, still found standing in the countryside as beam posts used in the crushing of olives. He wrote and published 2 articles about them, Monoliths in the Island of Cyprus and Monoliths in Cyprus. But the eminent British Assyriologist, the Reverend Archibald Henry Sayce, thought they were Bethels, or sacred stones from the Semitic world, which were brought by the Phoenicians to Cyprus. Guillemard ridiculed this notion with the following commentary. These curious and at first sight puzzling monuments of a bygone age are thus the fulcra of levers of oil or wine presses, and I fear that if anyone ever fell prone to Professor Sayce's Bethels, they must have been no Phoenician filled with religious fervour, but some erring Roman husbandman filled with the juice of the Cyprus grape. While the excavations initially undertaken by the Cyprus Exploration Fund in the island left much to be desired scientifically, they nevertheless laid the groundwork for a more disciplined approach, at least amongst the British, to digging, if not to the acquisition of antiquities. Guillemard's own collecting of antiquities was typical. He made no list of his acquisitions in Cyprus in 1887 and 1888, published nothing about them, and donated them without any documentation or their provenances to the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge in 1888. Only a few of them have since been published, and some even came to the Nicholson Museum in the University of Sydney. What can currently be attributed to Guillemard's collection in the Fitzwilliam Museum today consists mostly of pottery and terracottas, with some small pieces of stone sculpture, nearly all from the 1st millennium BC. It's what you might expect a cultivated gentleman with classical training in Victorian England to have incidentally acquired. Thank you.